Hello, Happy New Year 2024, and welcome to APAC Games Weekly episode 45. This is of course our first episode of the new year, and as always I am your host Connell Suter. In case you're new to the show, on APAC Games Weekly we take you through the biggest news stories from across the APAC games industries. We'll diverge from our usual past week focus to include the last 3 weeks, as obviously we have had a short hiatus over Christmas. We are in for a bit of a big one to start 2024, with plenty of huge stories from all over Asia. We'll be beginning with final 2023 totals for game approvals in China. We'll then discuss new rules that are rocking that market, before going to Japan to talk about the biggest Switch game of 2024 and how it isn't a game that you would assume, probably. Then possible talks about Japan hosting the IOC Esports Olympics, and we'll finish on a couple of stories from Korea and Singapore. So, to kick off APAC Games Weekly 2024, we'll talk about China's almost record-breaking number of game approvals. China's regulators approved nearly 1,100 games in 2023. So 2023 ended as we basically predicted it, as a very solid year for game approvals in China. In 2023, in total, 1,076 games were approved, which is the highest number in 3 years. December ended up having 105 new licenses, adding on to the 900 plus that we've discussed from earlier months in the year. This is a phenomenally high number of approvals, only beaten by 2020, which had around 1,400. The NPPA, the National Press and Publication Administration, said the approvals, quote, support the prosperity and healthy development of the online game industry, unquote. So 2023 really did end up being the strong recovery that the market needed and that we predicted on this show. However, 2024 has unfortunately started with some less than positive news. China announces new rules for games, particularly targeting the protection of minors. So, following our previous positive story about the wonderful number of game approvals last year, the NPPA has also announced new rules for video games, and it hasn't gone down super well. To summarise, the new rules specifically target, quote, luck-based draw features, unquote, for minors. This means companies will no longer be able to include daily login rewards, they have to have spending limits for players, they apparently have to store data in China as opposed to outside it, and one thing that I've seen mentioned a few places, but it seems a little out of step with the rest, is that online games will not be allowed to force players to fight each other. Whatever that means. I'm assuming that you have to have a PvP aspect that then makes people buy more because they want to be able to beat the players. Something like that. Before we talk about the reaction of gamers, we'll focus on the hard facts of money. The announcement of these plans wiped 80 billion USD in value from across the country's biggest games companies. Some companies had their stocks lose 25% of their value, which is pretty nuts. It ranges from around kind of 10% up to 25 being the highest. It's a pretty crazy thing to see. Since the announcement, the regulator has stated that these changes are intended to promote healthy development of the industry and to protect young gamers. Gamers in the region have felt blindsided by the news and have shared sentiments essentially boiling down to the view that these regulations are counter to the focus on growing the market that seemed to be taking place throughout last year. These regulations are obviously pretty major for certain games and certain genres of games, but as they're not yet implemented and appear to be in some level of drafting as opposed to live, it's unclear quite what impact they will have. Obviously, it's pretty crazy news. There's another story later on that follows it on and does provide a little bit of something to think about when it comes to the immediate response to rules like this. But certainly that value lost is pretty crazy and there's no getting that back right away. So we'll have to see really how this happens. One other note to mention on that is that since these have been announced, one of the main people at the group that set these regulations has been fired by the government. So it's possible that this was a slightly rogue maneuver. Perhaps they hadn't done all the research, and that value lost is not sitting well with some. It's hard to say. It's certainly a bit of a strange one, but hopefully we'll hear more about this and a little bit more clarification over the next month or so. And now to Japan. IOC reportedly sees Japan as the potential host of the 2026 Olympic Esports Games. So, according to sources close to the discussions, the IOC has supposedly called on Japan to offer themselves wholeheartedly as the hosts of the 2026 Olympic Esports Games, which is pretty major news. You might remember that the IOC held the first ever Esports Week last year in Singapore, and towards the end of the year, apparently, I didn't hear about this, but the IOC president Thomas Bach announced plans to set up an Olympic esports games due to esports growth in Asia, and particularly its appeal among young people. As such, those sources that are close to the matter, so we can trust it with some authority, say that the Japanese officials will be leveling up their organization and discussion with the IOC in 2024. Japan is, in some ways, however, a rather odd choice as a host among Asian countries. Ultimately, it's not the biggest esports country in Asia by far, falling way behind Korea and China, but it has one huge thing going for it, which is that it is hosting the 2026 Asia Games, which also, of course, as we saw this year, include esports. Those will be held in Nagoya. So this is pretty exciting news for esports and Japan. It'll certainly be really interesting to hear more about what will be included in the 2026 event, and if indeed it will be hosted in Japan. Certainly this is a bit of a departure from what the Olympics really does, which is essentially being an authority on sports, but sports of course don't have a publisher, they don't have a developer, so it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic grows. If we see games coming from certain companies, you can't really imagine many publishers refusing for a game to be included, but it's certainly quite an interesting one to think about. What will we see there? Who knows? Japan's best-selling Switch game of 2023 wasn't developed by Nintendo. So 2023 was a good year for the Switch and Nintendo generally. Lots of really high quality releases that received instant praise across the board on release. A number of these also capitalized on some of the biggest franchises like Pikmin, Zelda, and Mario. Pretty crazy to think that a game from each of those came out this year, or I should say last year. But would it surprise you to hear that none of those games outsold a physics puzzler about fruit? This is at least on downloads. We've not seen necessarily the box numbers, but obviously downloads are the main thing at this point. So the top selling downloadable game on Switch in Japan was Suika Game, Suika. I'm almost definitely mispronouncing it, which is a puzzle game popular among Japanese streamers. I've also seen that it was apparently originally intended as a sample game for trying with projectors, which, if true, is just a very odd extra note about this game's success. It's kinda hilarious, pretty weird, and a little bit wonderful in a way that a fairly straightforward puzzle game managed to beat some of the platform's biggest franchises in a year that was extremely successful for Nintendo worldwide. One note on this is that the game is also not free. It costs a very small amount, about $3 or 240 yen, so not a huge barrier to entry, but it's not like we're comparing a free downloadable game, which of course can be accessed by everybody. This still does have a cost to entry, as of course these other games do, although they cost a lot more than $3. Tears of the Kingdom was, however, the second most downloaded game on Switch, followed by many of Nintendo's bigger games. Interestingly though, Pikmin 4 was in third place and actually outsold Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which may not have been something Nintendo predicted. While Pikmin is of course a popular franchise, it isn't exactly Mario, is he? So it's pretty cool to see that the new version did so well. And now to Korea and Singapore for our final two stories. Riot Games resolves lawsuit over alleged League of Legends ripoff. So Riot has been seeking some financial restitution for a game it says is far too close to League of Legends in a number of ways. The Singaporean developer Sugar PTE will now pay Riot 1 million USD and stop selling the game I Am Hero AFK Tactical Teamfight, catchy name, due to its copied elements from League. In terms of games litigation, this one went surprisingly quickly. Sugar PTE initially stated in the court that they didn't believe the allegations were correct and that they said the copyrights were unenforceable. They have now realized, of course, that that was not the case. It's pretty crazy to think that even initially they thought they could fight Riot, who are one of the biggest games companies in the world, but certainly they must have had some belief that they wouldn't get caught with it, but of course they did, and Riot has, as is their right, sued over it and won that case. So fair play to Riot. An interesting one. Certainly you wonder if you'll see more of this, because there is a lot of games that copy elements from some of these major franchises. So unlikely it'll be the last time we hear about this, but probably one of the quickest we will hear about. Korean regulator KFTC hands out its largest ever fine. So this is a pretty interesting story on its own, but it is even more interesting when you consider the story from the top of the show about the new rules in China. Nexon Korea, the Korean gaming behemoth, has been fined just under 9 million USD for misleading players with its cube system in the game MapleStory. To make a long story short, the KFTC discovered that Nexon has been misleading players on the probability of drops since, wait for it, 2010. That's right, apparently the KFTC didn't notice this for 13 years, or at least hasn't stopped it for that entire time. I don't really understand how that happens, but anyway, at least it's been found out now. Essentially, cubes were loot boxes in MapleStory, and you need them for increasing the quality of your equipment, which can, increase the stats of it, and there was other similar event-based outcomes in certain situations. Over the last 13 years, and interestingly, publicly visible seemingly since 2011, they've been changing probabilities of drops in a variety of ways, including making certain cubes impossible to attain for periods of time. On top of that, they'd also stated that all cubes had the same probabilities, while some, of course, were much harder to get than others. That they were just better cubes, they should be rarer, but for some reason Nexon has presented this seemingly as, it's a random one, it's as much chance to get one as the other. What's weird is that it really reminds me a lot of McDonald's Monopoly, which I'm sure everyone has seen or maybe tried and is definitely sick of. In that, most of the properties are very easy to get, and usually there's one per street that's basically impossible. If you know anyone that ever cared about it and they actually filled out the little booklets, they always had every single page is full other than one spot on every page, and usually they never get filled. It seems to be a very similar case here, but of course this stretches over 13 years, and also keeping in mind that players have to buy the cubes. This isn't like McDonald's Monopoly in that it's something that is just a promotional free thing that comes along with your regular purchase. This fine is the highest ever set by the KFTC, which makes sense as it's 8.9 million USD. And that actually, interestingly, follows another fine to Nexon for the game Sudden Attack, which was around 720,000 USD. In that situation, players had to collect puzzle pieces, and you guessed it, certain pieces were almost impossible to attain. They had done a similar thing there though, where it was presented as being the same probability across all of them. So weirdly, this is a much higher fine for essentially the same thing. One of the reasons that they said the fine was so high was because they felt that this was the second time they had to deal with this issue with Nexon, and it just multiplied from there. Very understandable. It's pretty crazy news though, and it does make you think that as much as to us in the West, seeing some of these stories about what comes off to us as strict rules about games has a point to it. when you see stories like this from Korea, and it's not just Korea, obviously EA famously had to speak to some people in Europe a few years ago, and there was some famous stuff about surprise mechanics as opposed to essentially admitting it's gambling. You can see why some do feel that children need to be protected specifically. But it's a very interesting story, certainly one to keep an eye on and see if this kind of bleeds over into any other games. As I said in the story, they had to make a public statement in 2011 saying that no, all the probabilities are the same, because I believe players had said, this doesn't make sense, the cubes definitely are not the same probability, in our actual playing of the game we can see this isn't true. When they came out and then said no it is, and then here we are 13 years later going, oh actually no it wasn't the case, and they were doing it the whole time. It's utterly bizarre, and I don't really understand how this has got so far into it before they were caught. But as I say, at least it's sorted now, and it'll be really interesting to see if this goes over into any other areas of the games industry, at least even Korean games. And that was our final story for the first 2024 episode of APAC Games Weekly. Thank you so much for listening in as always, and I do hope you'll join me next Monday for episode 45. If you're listening on Spotify, just a heads up that there's now a version also available on YouTube with a simple video backing. And if you're watching/listening on YouTube, welcome. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you've not listened to the previous 44 episodes, you can check them out in the link in the description, which goes to our Spotify. But anyway, thanks again so much for listening in, and I will see you next Monday, 12 p.m. GMT, for episode 46.